Pac-Man World 2 was a great sequel to Pac-Man World 1. It tidied up the formula they introduced in the first game into something very entertaining. However, it felt pretty safe, like they didn't do anything too wild. They just improved the controls and created slightly more intricate levels. While I did thoroughly enjoy it, I couldn't help but to wish they did a little bit more with the level design, have more opportunities to really get the most out of Pac-Man's excellent moveset. And in that regard, I was very interested in seeing how Pac-Man World 3 would bring new things to the table. This seems to be the black sheep of the trilogy. You wouldn't believe the amount of people telling me not to even play this game, but just for the record, guys, it doesn't really matter to me whether or not a game is good or bad. I'm more so concerned whether or not it would make for an interesting episode. I beat Bubsy 3D after all, and I do think that Pac-Man World 3 would be an interesting subject for a great episode. Unlike the first two games, which were developed by an in-house team at Namco, Pac-Man World 3 was developed by a different studio entirely. Blitz Games, a company mostly known for creating licensed games like the Burger King games and a couple of Nickelodeon titles. They have made some original stuff too, like Glover, a game while to many it may not hold up incredibly well, had some very interesting and original ideas. So if they can at least bring that level of creativity to the existing and functional Pac-Man World formula, well, that's all I really want from a Pac-Man World 3. Interestingly enough, the game wasn't even originally a Pac-Man World game. It was originally going to be another side game, Pac-Man Adventures. While the game was in pre-production, many of the game's characters and environments were designed by Don Bluth, an animator well known for his work on films such as The Land Before Time, All Dogs Go to Heaven, and some FMV games like Dragon's Lair and Space Ace. He envisioned a very different kind of world for Pac-Man, one filled with alien-like monsters. There was even this bizarre reimagining of the main character from Dig Dug involved. It was going to be a game with a much darker storyline. There's a pretty long story about the troubled development of this game, but long story short, from what I've heard, Namco didn't like the direction, and Don Bluth ended up leaving the team. Blitz Games was then told to rework what they had into the third entry in the Pac-Man World series. It's a game that was originally something totally different and had a very rocky development, and as such I can see why people didn't really like it that much. It was probably very different than what they were expecting after playing the first two games, but of course I won't know for sure until I play it myself, so why don't we pop it in and get our pack on one last time. Brady, do you want to put that in for me? Oh wow, that title screen, man, the first two games open up with these swinging tunes, having Pac-Man's gigantic smiling face dead center of the screen, even playing hacky sack with a logo. It's a party, it's big good fun. But this time we've got this ambient shot of clouds slowly rolling by as this heavenly yet foreboding orchestra plays. I can tell already, this is gonna be a very different kind of game. The story begins with Pac-Man and his family celebrating his 25th birthday. I suppose since Pac-Man World was to celebrate his 20th, here we've got another game to celebrate his 25th.
Aw, sweetie, you're only as 25 as you feel.
Thanks, honey. You and Junior are the best presents I ever had. And you're right. I look fantastic.
Wait, did Pac-Man just... Oh, okay, I guess he can speak in this game. It is a tad jarring at first, but it really didn't bother me after a little bit. It's not like the characters never spoke in this series before. Miss Pac-Man speaks in the first game, and Professor Pac spoke a lot in World 2, so I didn't think it was too out of the ordinary. What is out of the ordinary, though, is that Pac-Man starts inexplicably warping everywhere as his wife and son watch in total confusion. Pac-Man is then teleported to an underground, sewage-looking area, where he's then contacted by a ghost named Orson.
Teleportation is not so easy.
Orson? Is that you?
Yeah, the very same Orson that built Toc-Man in Pac-Man World 1. I suppose after the events of World 1, he's had some time to reconsider his actions. And I guess some time to, recover being eaten alive. He explains to Pac-Man that he needs his help, but since teleportation is not an easy thing to pull off, he accidentally landed Pac-Man underground somewhere. He then asks Pac-Man to make his way to the surface so they can discuss something very important. And that's where we start. So yeah, Pac-Man controls pretty similarly to how he did in Pac-Man World 2. His weight is a little bit heavier, but it still feels very good. Pac-Man retains his 2 signature moves. He's got the butt bounce and the rev, though this time the butt bounce is no longer used for gaining height. If you bounce, you actually don't go higher than your original jump, so what's even the point of it? That press circle to punch. Oh. No, don't tell me this game's got, yeah, it's got combat. This game has combat. If there's one thing I've grown to loathe in platformers from the early to mid 2000s, it is having a dedicated combat system. I mean, it can be done well, as was the case with Rayman 3. That game's combat is pretty dope, but man, I've just played so many platformers with dull and boring combat, and yeah, you can add Pac-Man World 3 to the list of them. Now, there's a big difference between a game having enemies and a game having combat. Enemies in platformer games usually serve more so as an obstacle, being taken out without much damage, so they're a simple hurdle that you just gotta get past. But combat, that requires you stopping everything you're doing, engaging with your opponents, and fighting them for a prolonged amount of time. And this often takes a big focus away from the platforming and breaking up the pace in a way that I generally don't really like. You've only got a standard 3-hit combo that you'll execute by mashing the circle button over and over and over until they're dead. Alternatively, you can also use the butt bounce, which does do the job a tad faster, but you won't be able to use it on enemies that have spiked backs. 3 butt stomps in a row will also create a small shockwave that'll hurt enemies, so it's better for when you're tackling a big group. The rev can once again be used for attacking as well, but unlike World 2 that had you using it to take out single enemies, here you're using it to take out one of many enemies, and since they all require multiple hits to beat, it's just not a very intuitive way of attacking in this game. The only time I found revving to attack more helpful than the other 2 moves is for these spider robot things, because these things take way too many punches to kill, they take way too many butt stomps to kill, but they only take about 3 revs to kill, so for these guys, I was able to make an exception. Aside from those things, you're going to be mostly relying on the punch and the butt stomp, and this consists of spamming the punch until everything's dead, and spamming the butt stomp until everything's dead. It's not fun. You know, similar to games like Sonic Unleashed or Ty the Tasmanian Tiger 3 or Vex or any game I've reviewed before with combat that's not Rayman 3, the game will periodically slow to a crawl, having you enter a room that requires defeating everything on screen before it lets you advance. It feels very hindering, like, oh, I have to do this boring part to get to the good part. Like, why can't I just do the good parts? And with that said, though, why don't we talk about the good parts? Combat aside, the game plays fairly similar to Pac-Man World 2. You know, you're navigating a linear stage filled with obstacle courses and finding hidden collectibles and triggering mechanisms by pushing buttons and running on rev pads. The levels aren't as hallway-like as they were before. It's more like a series of rooms that all contain a handful of obstacles and puzzles, and it all feels constructed very much with Pac-Man's moveset in mind. Well, not so much the butt bounce, since that thing isn't useful for jumping anymore, but they really got the most out of the rev move. This was something that was used very sparingly in Pac-Man World 2, you know, just for the occasional ramp, but here we've got curves, slopes, and tracks, all sorts of different types of terrain that really make the most out of this thing. One of my favorite rev obstacles was this slope right here. You have to roll up and then curve to the left or right as you roll back down to get up to this higher ledge, repeating the process to climb all the way up. It's also really great for long jumping. Previously in Pac-Man World 2, if you were to jump while revving, it would cancel your momentum entirely, but here you'll continue forward as you roll, making it great for clearing long gaps, especially when you don't have very much space to work with. The bounce is still used for bouncing off of trampolines though. We don't have those awesome ones from Pac-Man World 2 that gave you some serious air. Instead, we're back to the ones from the first Pac-Man World that were mostly used just for transitioning areas. On top of the returning moves, Pac-Man also sports a new wall jump move. It's responsive and functions well. Like, I always get flashbacks to Vex's horrible wall jump, so it's really good to see one working as it should. There's actually a number of new actions like swinging on poles and climbing fences. The ledge grab's back and it feels better than ever. It's even more responsive than in 2, and climbing up out of it is a little more snappier and quicker. Since Pac-Man has a slightly wider moveset, the levels do feel more varied. It's rare that I feel like I've been doing the same thing over and over. There's a healthy variety to the way you'll navigate the course. This is all stuff I was hoping they would have in Pac-Man World 3. I think the level design is solid. It does, however, lack the challenge factor that Pac-Man World 2 had. It wasn't a terribly difficult game, but there was a level of skill and practice involved in completing each level. Here, I never really felt that my skills were ever being tested, you know? Even if the game does do more interesting things level-wise, it is all a tad on the easy side. As you play through any given level, you'll listen to many conversations Pac-Man has with Orson, discussing the tasks at hand and their strategies for dealing with the oncoming challenges.
I'm detecting a rise in energy in your sector, Pac-Man.
Details of my sector's energy should be between me and Miss Pac. Thank you very much.
What? I think the writing is actually pretty solid. Pac-Man's portrayed as a really positive dude. He's always got a good attitude, and while he may mock his friends time to time, it's all in good friendly fun.
Help! Who?
There's a part where this guy thinks he's this big hero who escaped the villain's stronghold, and he helps Pac-Man get into it, but it turns out he was just the janitor who was laid off last week. But even though it sets him up with the perfect opportunity to rip into him and make fun of him, Pac-Man doesn't. He reassures him that he is a hero in a way, since he helped Pac-Man get so far.
I'm a hero, alright?
Sure you are, buddy. You helped me get this far. Hear that, Erwin?
Yeah, man, Pac-Man's just really nice, you know? There were actually a number of lines that got a fair share of smiles and maybe some chuckles out of me.
It's been a while since I defeated an army. Actually, I've never done it. Do we have a plan?
Not so much of a plan, Pac-Man, as a giant robot fitted with arms that go puncha, puncha. Plus a gun that goes daka daka.
I'd better get a chomping.
There's even a Homestar Runner reference in this game.
Kinda hard to type with boxing gloves on, Horse. Got a plan B?
Wow, that is not something I expected from this game. A strong bad reference. That's good taste, though. Really good taste, dude.
I don't know. It seems like a pretty general thing. It's definitely. I don't think it's a strong bad reference. It's a coincidence, if anything.
But Brady, that's no. There's no way it's not. Like that's totally a strong bad reference.
Yeah. Okay, bud.
It. Who killed Brady? While the writing is good, the plot and setting overall speak a very foreign tone, totally inconsistent with the series so far. I mean, look at the worlds of Pac-Man World 1 and 2. It's Pac-Land, cheerful and bright, blooming with vibrant greens and blues and colors with this fun spark to them. Here, it looks like Orson teleported Pac-Man into the wrong game. This looks like a Metroid Prime level, not something I'd expect from Pac-Man World. There's a much more detailed plot this time too. While before we had Pac-Man saving his own birthday party and saving Pac-Land from a cartoony ghost named Spooky, this time there's an evil scientist alien thing named Erwin. I don't know about you, but this is the last thing I think of when I think of a Pac-Man villain. It looks more like an Invader Zim character or one of the butt-ugly Martians. He wants to harness the energy of the spectral realm. This is essentially a parallel world where the ghosts all come from. Inky, Blinky, Pinky, Clyde, and of course Orson all hail from the spectral realm, but with Erwin trying to tear the energy from it, the spectral realm has begun to collapse into the real world, which is a big problem for both the ghosts and Pac-Man. Erwin's kidnapped Inky and Blinky, with Pinky and Clyde still missing in action. Pac-Man's now gotta put his differences aside and work with the ghosts to defeat Erwin and save both realms. I don't know, I think it's a tad too dark for a Pac-Man plot. Like, we're talking about a character who has a flagship smile as his constant look. We're not talking about Sonic, who's always been the edgier and cooler mascot, the one who's got some tude sporting the furrowed brow, even in the earliest of Sonic games. I was never bothered by Sonic dabbling in a more serious plot here and there because that's how I've always felt about Sonic in regards to the tone of the character. But Pac-Man, he's just not the kind of character I would imagine getting dragged into a plot like this, and I totally understand why people feel so strongly against it. It's this bizarre remains of a much different kind of game after all, and it mutated into this strange Part 3 of the Pac-Man World series. Having a consistent tone throughout a series is something that is very important. When you establish something that people grow to love very much and then you change that drastically, well, then you risk people hating it or having a hard time adjusting to it.
You wanted to talk? You shot me to death earlier in this video.
Exactly. It was a funny bit, the Who Killed Hannibal from Eric Andre, but did that really belong in this video? It was much darker in tone than the types of jokes you're probably used to me telling on this show. Now, while I do not like the plot overall, there is a lot about it that I do enjoy. I love seeing Pac-Man's interactions with the ghosts, who all have like Jersey or Brooklyn accents for some reason now. That's pretty great, I'm not gonna lie.
Dragging him all the way in here was a real hassle, chump.
Clyde especially. Wait a minute, I thought Clyde was the orange one. Yeah, he is. Okay, for some reason the red one's Clyde now. This was also a change they made in Pac-Man World 2, but I didn't notice it because he had much less screen time. But I am noticing it now because he's a major character, and I'm really not sure why they made this change, especially since you can play the original Pac-Man in this game, and there, it'll still tell you that the orange one is Clyde, so that's weird. Anyway, in this game, Pinky and Clyde will accompany Pac-Man along his adventure. There's going to be segments where you'll take control of Clyde or Pinky and play a portion of the level as them. Pinky's segments are all about puzzle solving. She can see platforms that Pac-Man can't and can solidify them so he can then land on them. She can only have 3 platforms solidified at once, so you'll have to plan accordingly. These puzzles are cool, but I found them a little bit simple. Like, you just go through the motions. There's no way you're not going to be able to figure it out. It doesn't require any real thought. It's a great concept, but I think they could have done a lot more cool stuff with it. What's here just ends up being cool, but just okay with the execution. Clyde, on the other hand, is more so about combat. You can use his howl attack to knock over pillars and large objects that Pac-Man will then use to advance, but he's also used for defeating spectral ghosts. Now, these types of ghosts will appear periodically in any given stage. Like the other combat segments, the game stops you in place, having you defeat them all before advancing. There's a couple of moments in the game where you'll get to use Clyde to defeat them all, but otherwise you'll rely on the power pellets, allowing Pac-Man to gobble them up. And while this does check off one of the things that's kind of essential in a Pac-Man game, you know, eating ghosts, these segments are just flat out boring. You get a power pellet and walk into them, grab another one when it runs out and walk into them, you wait for them to respawn, when it runs out you get it and you walk in, and then you do this for 3 minutes and then you can advance. It's bad. It's not the kind of bad that stems from the game being poorly programmed or designed and frustrating, but the kind of bad that has everything working exactly as it should, but it's just not fun to do. There's power-ups to try to make the combat somewhat more interesting, like the Chrome Ball, which returns, this time only making Pac-Man invincible to enemy attacks. We've also got the Electroshock Pellet that replaces Pac-Man's punch with a shock move. It's okay, it's great for the Beyblade-looking enemies, but anything else, it's not incredibly useful. The Super Stomp Pellet is pretty cool, creates a large shockwave when you butt stomp, knocking out a ton of enemies. The last one is the Ribbon Pellet, which is probably the coolest one. It has Pac-Man leaving a stream of light as he runs, so if you run around some enemies, it'll collapse on the enclosed enemies and cause great damage. Those last two are kind of fun to use, but it's really not enough to keep the combat from getting incredibly dull very quickly. A lot of these enemies just require way too many hits to beat, and they throw way too many at you. I don't think the dull combat ever made me hate this game though, because I actually do really like the platforming sections. There's plenty of stage gimmicks to keep things fresh. The abundance of different mechanisms, I think, is what made these parts fairly strong for me. There's puzzles that have you hammering in nail-like platforms to raise other platforms. Sometimes you'll need to find a crystal to activate a device that'll create a dot chain, bringing you to another area. Sometimes mandatory, sometimes a nook or cranny that simply hides collectibles. Yeah, that's another thing I really liked about this game. The nooks and crannies, they were handled so much better. With levels being somewhat more open and less hallway-like than in World 2, there's much more room for hidden areas, giving the player much more freedom to explore and find stuff. I, personally, do prefer more open-ended and explorable platformers than linear ones, so this was a big improvement for me. The hidden collectibles were handled a little bit better too this time. At any given point, you can click in the stick to see exactly how many of each fruit you have, so it's a little easier to keep track as you play the level. You still have to get them all in the same run for it to count, which is something I still don't like, but at least the dots aren't part of it anymore, so they're not pushing the tedium nearly as hard. And of course, the Galaxians once again return, warping you to a classic maze segment. There's still nothing to write home about, but they're easily the most refined ones so far. Firstly, you can actually see the full board at once, and there's also these boost pads to give you fun bursts of speed. But what kills it this time is the horrible ghost AI. Like, you know how the 4 ghosts were all supposed to act somewhat differently? Like, I think one's supposed to chase you, there's one that's supposed to cut you off, one tries to fake you out, and then the last one is just oblivious and minds its own business, right? In these maze segments, they're all oblivious. They all mind their own business. Like, I swear they never make an effort to come even remotely close to you. They all just go wherever they want. I think the actual design of the maze themselves is the best in the series so far, but you gotta have some challenge, and since Pac-Man World 1 had those annoying obstacles that did not blend well with the stage at all, I think I gotta give it to Pac-Man World 2 for having the most well-balanced and best mazes in the series. Alright, so what you get for collecting all of the fruit, it's not nearly as cool as it was in World 2. While before you'd unlock these classic arcade Pac-Man games, you now unlock a trading card. Like, you get everything in the stage. Yeah, here's a trading card. Cool, I guess. It's got Pac-Man on it. Neat. There's also a number of silver Pac-Man statues in every level, and you'll get another card if you can collect all of them as well. If you really want to look at them, they can be viewed from the museum. Here you can also play the original Pac-Man. There's also a record of every arcade Pac-Man title, which is kinda cool, I guess. I mean, it's cool to look there and be like, ooh, Pac-Mania, what was that? Ooh, Pac-Man VR, what was that? But man, I just really wish they had those unlockable arcade games again. Like maybe some we didn't see before, like Pac-Land or that weird Pac-Man VR game that I don't think has ever been publicly available in any official shape or form since its original arcade release. Well, you can at least read a paragraph about them all. Well, to the museum's credit, you can at least view this really cool interview with the creator of Pac-Man here. It's a really nice bit, and I do love seeing stuff like it. And another field in which I have to give the game credit where credit is due is the presentation. It is very good. My only issue with it was the frame rate, which will dip a little bit now and then, and that's a tad disappointing because 2 ran at a solid 60. It never does go below 30, but it is very noticeable a lot of the time. Otherwise, the game is very well produced. Not only are the controls and hit detection very precise and polished, but the game also looks very good. Like, look at these portals. Looking at them from the side, they're 2D, but from the front, they have depth. How did they do this? That's cool as hell. And these environments, while they do look like they'd be better off in something that's not Pac-Man, they do look really pretty. Pac-Man himself, too, like the way light reflects off of his body in real time, giving him that golden glow as he explores ancient temples. It looks really good, I'm not gonna lie. I wish I could say the same for the enemy designs though. I think the specters look cool, but these enemies are just big gross hulking monster things. Other than that, it's just generic looking robots and Beyblades. And as I've said before, I hate Irwin's design. I think it looks downright dumb. And more importantly, it sure as hell doesn't look like a Pac-Man villain, that's for sure. The only real boss fights in this game are the ones you'll have with Irwin. You'll use the rev pads to activate these nodes to knock out his shield so you can do damage, dodge his attacks, rinse and repeat until he's done. It's not a bad fight, but it and the final fight with Irwin are the only 2 in the entire game. There's also 2 sections where you'll get to pilot a new Toc-Man that Orson built, which is cool in theory. You know, it's a nice throwback to Pac-Man World 1, and you getting to pilot him, wow, that should be cool. But it only boils down to more button mashing combat that has you patiently waiting for the next platforming level. And one thing that really stuck out to me was the music. It's very different than before, favoring very ambient tracks over the upbeat and exciting tracks from World 1 and 2. But my problem is not the music, but rather the lack of music. There's so many parts of this game that straight up have no music at all. And I'm not talking, oh no, there's no music, instead there's ambient sounds. No, I'm talking dead silence. You're doing some platforming and you're just listening to nothing while you do it. And at first I thought my disc was scratched or something, so I looked up multiple gameplay videos from different users on YouTube, and the same parts all also had no music. It's just very bizarre to me. I don't know, I'm really split on this game. Like, there's a lot of things I think it does fairly well, but there's equally as many things that I think it does very poorly. The platforming, for instance, it feels like a natural evolution of that from Pac-Man World 2. There's actually a lot of things I was hoping they would do that they do expand upon and evolve in this game, but the pace is constantly brought to an absolute crawl by the totally boring combat sections. On the other hand, I do really like the writing in this game, but the tone and the plot are both things that are so foreign to the series that I have a hard time imagining Pac-Man World fans would be on board with it. In the end though, I still don't hate this game. You guys all made me go in with some pretty low expectations, so I was pleasantly surprised at how much of this game I did really like. Honestly, I think I like parts of it even more than parts of Pac-Man World 2. But of course, Pac-Man World 2 is easily the better game here. While its platforming isn't as inventive as 3's, it's so much more consistent with its quality. It had like 3 levels I didn't like that much, while in Pac-Man World 3, every level has parts I don't like. Yeah, I totally get why everyone hates this game so much, but honestly, I think the strong parts are strong enough to not really deserve that intense hatred. It's not an offensively terrible game, just a game with a lot of fun parts, a lot of mediocre parts, and a very questionable plot and setting. This is not the Sonic 06 of the Pac-Man World series. It's more like the Star Fox Adventures of the Pac-Man World series. You know, like, it's easy to hate on because it's the different one, it's the black sheep, and while it is flawed in many areas, it's still a fairly enjoyable game to a lot of people. Overall, I can at least say that I did walk away from this game with a fairly decent attitude towards it. Thinking back on it, I'm remembering a lot more of the parts I did like than all the parts that I didn't like, and I think that should at least speak for something. The game had some ports to PSP and the DS. The PSP version is exactly the same as the PS2 version, except the graphics are a tad less detailed, and the frame rate makes the game impossible to tolerate, so I definitely don't recommend this version. Like, look at this. This is terrible. The DS port is surprisingly faithful. It even runs at a stable frame rate, though for some reason they completely removed all of the dialogue, so you never have any context as to what's going on at any given time. The rev move is also now executed with these dumb and annoying touchscreen controls too. There's also a lot of sound effects and animations that are flat out missing, which kinda makes me feel like this port wasn't handled very well either. I can't really say I'd recommend either of these versions. If you really want to give it a shot, you gotta go with one of the console versions. If you've never given it a try because of all the negativity surrounding it, just know that there's a lot of things I do like about this game, so it's at least worth a shot if you've never played it before. It's dirt cheap on eBay, so it's a harmless venture if you ever feel like it. But if you did play it and you didn't like it, well, then you didn't like it. There's no helping that, and there's nothing wrong with that either. And we are done with the Pac-Man World trilogy, and I gotta say, I really enjoyed this series. I'm glad I finally gave them all a playthrough. It makes me wish they continued with the series. You know, I think the platforming genre works very well for the character, and for the first time since the 80s, this series would peak in popularity thanks to the Pac-Man World trilogy. This series sold like over 4 million copies. Like, they made a lot of money off of this series.
Get your money, Pac-Man!
And they would eventually make those, like, what is it, the Ghostly Adventures games or whatever, and maybe someday I'll check those out too for the channel, but for now it seems like Pac-Man has yet to have another proper stab at the world formula, and I think that's something a lot of people would love to see Namco bring back. I mean, like, I totally get it now, because I played a lot of Pac-Man as a kid, but never did I ever consider myself a Pac-Man fan, you know? Like, those games are just very simple, kind of fun, but I'm not gonna be a fan of this series. But after playing the Pac-Man World series, oh man, I would totally consider myself a Pac-Man fan.